Hello everyone, my name is Damas Nawanda. I work as an art director and concept artist for the game industry back in Indonesia. Today, I'll be sharing a little bit of introduction about the world of concept art. Hopefully, by today, you'll understand what is and what is not a concept art, how they will help the production, what problems they solve, and the workflow most concept artists use when working. So, what is a concept art? Most students think concept art is just about making beautiful and cool drawings. But unfortunately, that's not true. That opinion is just a part of it. It is actually about generating ideas and solving design problems that helps the clients and the directors. That means you're actually like an idea machine. You as a concept artist will need to provide multiple ideas to the client or director. Imagine a concept artist is like someone who shows the director different cards of ideas and asks him which one he likes best. Is it this one, or this one? The director will then choose one and maybe ask you to develop that idea even further until he finds it suitable for his design problem. So, how do you make a good design? First of all, it should always answer the design problem. For example, the client asks you to visualize his idea for a specific building in his game. Before you start drawing, you should figure out what are the design problems to solve for that building. Most of the time, those problems are provided by your clients in the form of what, where, when, why, and how statements. For example, the client wants you to design a flower shop in a cyberpunk Kyoto where the main character will be able to meet another key character. They will provide you with a brief that includes a more in-depth 5W1H statements, which then you should answer one by one by doing research and design explorations. Then, your final design must incorporate the visual solutions of those what, where, when, why, and how problems. So let's get into it. The what question could define what kind of building it is and what function it has. Is it a shop? Is it an abandoned hotel? Is it a hospital? The answers to this question will hone you in to specific design elements that's not suitable for other type of building. For example, to describe a flower shop, you can research from the internet how they look like, or you can actually go find a flower shop in your area. You might find that elements such as product display, big windows, shop signs, promo signs, and awnings are prominent features in the references. Those elements should be taken note of and will be important to use in the final design. There might be more of what questions that can be involved in the design. For example, is the shop open or closed? Is it a busy shop or an empty, almost bankrupt one? Next is the where question. The where question will define where the building is located. This will affect directly on how that shop will look like. Is it in Kyoto, Africa, or London? Each will have distinct architecture that separates them from each other. The characteristics of that architectural style will need to be incorporated into the final design. For example, Japanese buildings have this unique curved roof and wooden walls. We'll have to take note of those elements to be incorporated into our final design. Other where questions can include where the building is built. Is it on the side of the road? Is it on a plaza? Or is it on the rooftop or inside a building? Next is the when. The when will define the era and the time. Is it in the medieval era, a modern era, a cyberpunk era, or maybe a space sci-fi era? The era will also affect on what kind of technology that exists and also how that building will look and function. A building in the medieval period will be built with limited materials and with distinct construction compared to the one from the modern era. How different it is should be researched and taken note of. For our case, the cyberpunk era might include metallic materials, futuristic technology that open doors and windows, and some neon lights. The when question may also talk about the time of day. Is it in the morning where the shop hasn't been opened and the items has not been prepared? Or is it in the day where business is really busy? Next is the why question. The why could explain the motivation the character has to that building. Is he there to salvage? Is he there to meet someone? Or maybe simply to shop? Each of that different problem might result in a different kind of layout design for the interior. For example, to meet a key character, the layout could be made to lead the player to where that character is located on the shop, maybe at the back of the shop. In comparison to the motivation for shopping, the layout could feature different pathways to the displayed items and then finally converges and leads the player into the cash register. The last question is the how question. The how question could explain how the character will interact with the building, or maybe how that building functions. A shop can be broken down to several steps of how the player tend to use it. First one, the player needs to be able to identify the shop. 2. The player needs to figure out where the character to meet is. 3. The player needs to walk to the back of the shop. And 4. The player needs to talk to that character. These steps should be visualized in terms of the objects involved and the layout and the sequential placement that allows the activities to happen. For example, first, to identify the shop, you need to display flower products, shop name, and maybe some promo signs in front of the shop. And then, second, to figure out where that character is located, we can provide another character in front of the shop to ask for direction. And thirdly, to walk to the back of the shop, we need to design the layout in a way that the player can identify a path to the back of the shop. It must not be hidden. 4. Talk to that character. We need to design the back of the shop layout that it finally leads to that key character. Another example of the how question are how does the shop door work? How does normal people in that world shop for flowers? Do they go in or they purchase from the front of the building? Having all those design problems answered will make your concepts really strong. It is a good idea to not rush doing the research and brainstorming to answer those questions. Once all of these questions has been solved, it is time to convey that visually into the design. The second characteristics of a good design is clarity. A concept art must have good clarity, because what is the use of having really cool ideas but the director or client cannot understand it? Which is why it is very important to present your ideas in the best way possible so that the viewer will understand it right away. Because sometimes in the final product, may it be a movie or a game, your design might only be shown for only a few seconds. In those short seconds, your design must visually communicate instantly. There are a few ways to do this, but one thing we all can do is to make the focal point really obvious. A focal point is the main element of your design that has the biggest impact, that also explains what it is all about. In order to enhance the focal point, you play with its contrast compared to the rest of the design. This can be done by making the focal point to be bigger, have the most unique color, or shape compared to the rest of the image. Another is to use appropriate elements of design that solves that particular problem effectively. The third characteristics of a good design is suspension of disbelief. A concept art must also invoke a sense of believability to the viewer. That means the viewer must feel that the design can belong to that world naturally, inside its rules and possibilities. It does not feel out of place. One example of this rule being broken is when there is an element that has incorrect scale, like a chair's size should not be three times as big as the person, especially if the world is a realistic one. This, of course, doesn't apply if the design lives in a stylized or cartoony world where everything is deliberately exaggerated. Though a concept doesn't have to be super realistic in terms of how it functions and built, we do not have to be as accurate in measurements as an architect or an engineer. Because we are working for the entertainment industry, as long as it is seemingly believable, most of the time we are okay, unless the project requires otherwise. The fourth characteristics of a good design is being able to deliver them on time. To be able to be a reliable concept artist, we need to be able to deliver usable results within the schedule every time. Our reliability is way more important than perfection. It is quite different than a fine artist that pursues perfection every time. They might work on their paintings over months and months. The studio simply doesn't have that kind of budget and will not hire you if that is how long it takes for you to do one painting. So, to do that, we need a good and reliable workflow that can produce good results every time. Alright, now let's take a look at the kind of concept art that you can do. Some artists actually prefer to specialize in one, but some other artists enjoy working on multiple types of concept art. Here are some examples of how different kind of concept art solves different types of problems. First up is character design. So, what is a character design? A character designer is an artist that creates original character for a purpose. The character designer is usually the first person on a production to begin visualizing the characters from description given to them for a story. He will concentrate on the character creation only. His main goal is to create the best character design or attributes needed for that specific role in the story at hand. What does a character designer do? Firstly, they must immerse themselves into the story or script. The next step for a character designer is to thoroughly research any anatomical, costume, historical, style, or theatrical references needed to create the character needed for the project. Next step is drawing. Lots and lots of drawing. Depending upon the whims of the director or art director and the timeline for the project, anywhere from 4 to hundreds of versions of the single character can be created. The idea here is to not settle on your first version. Create many varied versions of the same character so you and your team can analyze the best features for that character. Showing character personality through poses and facial expressions is important even in these early stages. An important part of character designer's job is to bring something more than just visual design to the character he or she is creating. They must begin the process of imbuing them with personality and life. Creating model sheets. Once a final design is chosen, the character designer, or in large studios, a secondary or assistant character designer, will oftentimes be called upon to create model sheets for the character. This will oftentimes include an orthographic model sheet that shows the character from multiple angles, usually for views side, front, three-quarter front, and back. This orthographic model sheet is used for multiple purposes depending upon if it's traditionally animated or CG animated character moving forward. If traditionally animated, the teams of animators will need this sheet to understand how the character and its costumes look from different angles while they are hand drawing it. For CG animations, that ortho sheet will be used by the CG modeler to create the dimensional version of the character in the computer. Lastly, some larger productions may want expression or posing sheets. They're to show the character in a range of emotions and poses for references and maybe for licensing images down the road. And that's the basics.
This is a simplified version of what is involved in the job. I hope it is helpful to give you a glimpse of what is the process and needs are for the job of a character designer. Here's one interesting example. One of the most talked about character of this year, Abby from The Last of Us 2. According to the game's art book, the brief for her design was a deft survivalist in her early 20s. Abby has a commanding presence, preferring utilitarian militaristic clothing. She is the image of a hardened soldier and wields a weapon with casual confidence. Her imposing muscular build reflects years of combat and strength training. Her generally unsmiling and serious expression conveys her straightforward, austere nature. If we look at the concepts that the Naughty Dog team made, you can see on the first image that Abby's face is designed to convey a hardened and serious young woman in her early 20s. The middle face even has a scar on her face. This might be designed to show her hard upbringing. Next, you can see here she is wearing a practical militaristic clothing. Definitely not something Abby would choose for the looks, because she doesn't care about that. Her gesture also conveys a sense of strength and discipline that the soldier would have. Next is environment concept art. Environment concept art primarily focuses on structuring and designing landscapes. It is used for setting and defining the place of the action and estimating the time of the action sequence. Since the setting of this sequence is one of the most challenging aspects of environmental concept art, the skill sets for the artist will require them to possess a good eye for composition, architectural design, and perspective. Environmental concept art emphasizes the layering and texturizing of the overall layout of the image. Each stroke on the screen that goes into creating the scene should be in accordance with the rest of the subjects, props, and the kind of action that is soon going to take place. For instance, if an adventurous sequence is going to take place on a sunny day, then the overall layout with all its color and tonal variations would be much different texturally and visually than the one which is meant to portray a much laid back or calming sequence. There would be considerable difference in the mood of the two sequences. These environmental sequences are mostly created using 3D software where the artist is in complete charge of reflecting and translating all the digital elements in the final design. This will form the atmosphere and mood that the project requires. Understanding the fundamentals of designing anything is the first step to get the job done successfully and in the best way. However, it is only by regularly practicing what you're trying to depict that will help you perfect your art. This holds true for every kind of conceptual art form. If you do want to take up designing environments, then you should focus on correcting your perspectives first. This plays a significant role in each piece. Remember that if any part of your perspective does not fit with the rest of your design, then it may ruin the entire effect of the painting. Environment artists also have to be swift and deft with their art portrayals, as that is a crucial aspect of depicting any fantasy or foreign object in an equally unfamiliar environment, such as aliens on a strange planet. As an environment artist, your primary task would be to imagine and visualize the worlds that don't even exist and turn them into convincing real thing for your audience to marvel at. Apart from fundamentals, you need to have an eye for great design and understand the basic objects such as plants, animals, the natural and geological attribute at least to the point where you would be able to easily replicate these ideas. Once you do understand these essential points, you should really practice environments as much as you can. You can even create a series of thumbnail sketches and painting over a set period of time, like a month or so. It could initially be pretty a challenging job for a paid concept artist to manage all of it on their own when they start creating stuff at first, as they will not be able to choose what they create. You may select a particular look for your art, but it's always going to be the client or studio who makes the final call. And this means that you will have to be an expert enough to portray anything they ask for, whether it is a plush manor interior, a serene village, or a sandy desert landscape. This will be a real test of your versatility as an artist. And since environments can often have people in them as well, you will have to be clear in your understanding of human anatomy and gestures, as well as understanding the height and weight differences. Next is props. The most important requirement for a digital artist is to be able to design any object from any given angle. Since 3D projections could be extremely challenging to equate and calculate, it usually takes a well informed and well experienced expert to make a carefully reviewed choices and approaches when it comes to designing. And more than being restricted to just video game designing, creating prop layouts is one of the most essential dimensions of animated movies or TV series. The concept artists involved in the project have to first experiment with different colors and tonal variations in order to be able to set a specific mood and edge to a single sequence. If you want to practice designing props, you can start by studying anything that appeals to you. Apart from mentally determining the properties of the object itself, an artist has to closely observe and analyze the styles and aesthetics of different periods to place a prop correctly in the appropriate frame and the sequence to which it belongs. For instance, the props for a story that has been set in the Victorian era in Britain will be very different from the props that should be in a sequence from, say, the American Civil War. It goes without saying that all celebrated artists have always observed and drawn inspiration from what they have seen around them in real life. The history and evolutionary phases of everything had always played the greatest part in studying the structures and forms of whatever it is that you're keen to depict. One of the ideal things that you can do is take a tour to museums or old heritage places and houses. You could always keep a sketchbook and doodle to capture every form that appeals to you. Drawing will help you understand the shapes and structures better, as well as enrich your visual library of new ideas. Even the most ordinary, commonplace objects such as stoves, lamps, tables, and literally anything you want to place in your imaginary world, because this design and style will provide you with an essential insight into the evolution of designs throughout the ages. It is entirely up to the designer of props to imagine and visualize how a certain thing will look from different angles and to render the minute details to them accordingly from scratch. Artists who take up the task of designing props may often specialize in different types of design and layouts. While some might take up designing commercial objects of various sorts of kinds, such as clothes, domestic things, or other stationery, some artists might take up designing vehicles and weapons specifically. You don't have to be really good at designing every kind of props. If you have a good enough ability to design some specific types of props, you'll have a good chance of getting hired by a top notch studio for their freelance projects. One of the most important things to improve your prop designing skills is to observe and practice drawing props as much as you can. You should try to understand uh, the forms, the shapes, and the functions of the small details and elements of that prop. For example, how does one joint differ from each other? What are they best used for? If you add more realistic designs to whatever you design, that will also improve your prop design qualities. Lastly, let's talk about vehicle designs. It's actually quite similar to designing weapons and assets. Creating designs, layouts for vehicles is a vital part of producing industrial designs. It is really pretty tough cookie to crack when it comes to the calculations and equation parts of the designing. Sometimes you really have to understand how those vehicles work in real life. Even though those vehicles doesn't exist in real life, it should always be based on technologies and functionalities of something that existed or exists in real life. One of the things you should look for when designing vehicles is to include all the functional elements of a type of vehicle. For example, if you want to design a ship, an airplane, you should include the wings, the cockpit, the engines, uh, and some kind of maybe aerodynamic qualities of the silhouette, but it always depends on the type of projects that you're working on. Sometimes the aerodynamic features of a ship is forgotten because that's not their style. Personally, I find myself really interested and challenged when designing these kind of vehicles because you get to dive into the engineering part of vehicle construction and design. Uh, I think it's really interesting. Now let's talk about the role of concept art in the production pipeline. Concept art is essential in many industries such as animations, TV series, movies, or games. But today we'll talk about its role in the game's development production. There are basically three stages of production where a concept artist might be working on. Those are the pre production, production, and marketing. The first one is the pre production stage, or what we usually call the blue sky approach. In this stage, concept artists are usually asked to do an open ended approach to concept design, which means that you can do the most creative thinking you possibly can that's not limited to a lot of restrictions. You can let your ideas fly and go a little bit crazy and worry about the details later, hence the name Blue Sky. By doing this, you really think outside of the box to problem solve your challenges. Once you've come up with multiple blue sky ideas, it is time to choose some and reel it in to see which one that we can actually do in the production. One of the benefits of doing projects like this is to break your normal design pattern and come up with some interesting and unique ideas that might not have been done before. Personally, this stage is the most fun stage to work for me. There are many phases in the game's production, and a concept artist has a particular role in each. Some artists are hired even before the funding is in place, pitching concepts to investors just as the game is conceived. When the pre production for a game starts, most of the work is blue sky, meaning it's focused on exploration and finding the visual style of the game. This is the most open ended phase of the game, during which time artists usually have more freedom to illustrate their own ideas. As pre production comes to a close, the creative ideas in a game are resolved. These kind of concepts are usually given to the more senior artists because it requires a stronger sense of design and style that can only be developed through years and years of practice. Let's look at some examples of blue sky concept art. The first one here is from Finian McManus. This piece looks really interesting and I really like it. And if you look closely, You can see that this concept doesn't have that super polished quality finish because at this stage, that type of finish is not required at all. As we've mentioned before, one of the focus of this stage is to explore the visual style of the game or film. And the second one is a concept by Feng Zhu. This is his take for the Hobbit movie adaptation. This wasn't made into a real movie, but this was done for his FZD videos that you can find in YouTube. This is a concept for the Hobbit village environment, the Shire. As you can see, it looks quite different from what you see in the movies, because in the books, the Hobbit hole is only described as something like houses built under the hill. That is clearly not a very specific description of the house, which allows us concept artists to explore into many different style and direction of the house. And again, the blue sky approach and the pre-production is the perfect stage to explore that. On the other side of the spectrum, this blue sky concept art from the game The Last of Us 2 is not exploring the generic style or the visual direction of the game because the game has already established itself to have a very realistic art direction. But this concept art is actually focusing itself on on the mood, the setting, and the architecture of a particular scene. For this piece, they're trying to convey a scary and mysterious mood where the main character Ellie is encountering the enemy scars. Let's move on to the next type of concept art that you might do in the production pipeline. The second one is the production art. Production art. Production art is usually begun after the pre-production stage has been established and inside the production stage of the pipeline. Usually just when the project has been funded and the team has been gathered so that the project can be called officially started. There are some differences that the production art has compared to the blue sky concept art. Whereas before, the concept doesn't have to be super polished and details can be visually suggested, in this one, the concept art must be presented with clarity in mind. Because the main purpose of the production art is to help the 3D team build your concept for the final product. This usually requires a specific presentation of your concept art that focuses on clarity and explanations of the details of your concepts. This kind of concept art are done by junior artists to mid-level to senior artists. The kind of concept art that are given to those different levels are quite different as well. For example, the junior artists are usually given a more menial kind of designs to do, for like barrel design, door designs, fence design, or cars in the background designs. As for the more senior artists, they are given a more significantly important designs that are usually have a bigger view time in the product, or it has a far more impact in the storytelling of the product. Here are some different examples of how a production art can be presented. First one is the orthographic view. Orthographic means looking at something from a flat angle. For example, you're looking at the design from the front, the back, the right, the left, or the bottom. This kind of presentation for a concept art really benefits the 3D team when they're building the design for the final product. Because if you look at some of these examples, the 3D modeler actually only needed to trace the orthographic concept art while doing his sculpting. Hmm. Next is the three-quarter overview concept. This is mostly used for environments concepts. The benefits of this presentation is to convey the spatial design between objects. Think about how objects relate to each other. Maybe they are placed closely to each other because they have a strong connection to each other. Maybe they are connected by a cable or something, or they have a function that affect each other. And most importantly, is how to set dress the scene with storytelling in mind. More than that, the three-quarter view also explains how the space will be used by the characters in that game or in the movie. You can even set which are the interactable areas that the player can go to. If you look at this concept design I made a while back, this is a three-quarter concept for the main character's house who lives in a desert village. You can see there are interactable objects that the player can go to and maybe interact in different kind of ways. For example, the player can go to the bed to rest and maybe save the game, and then the player can go to the roasting pit where they can cook some food and maybe restore some of their health. And if you also look at the layout, you can see how the player can walk around this space and reach those interactable points, and also how I set dress the area to look like something from the Native Americans' villages. Next is cutaways. Cutaways looks like something that's been cut in half. You open it up and you can see what's inside of it. Cutaway designs are useful for the 3D team to understand how a design is built and how it might work. This will really help to sell the believability of the design, especially if it has some functionality to it. Of course, we don't want to create a design that makes the viewer think it doesn't make sense and maybe break their immersion. It is especially helpful if your design is going to be moving or animated. Having defined the workings of your design from the inside is really going to help the animator think how it can be moved. Callouts. Callouts are additional presentation that explains the details of your main concept. In the callout, you can describe that detail as another drawing, another three-quarter view, or simply a reference to a picture. Marketing art. Sometimes, once the production stage is done, the concept artist will be asked to do an illustration for marketing. What they deliver here is quite different from the previous stages because a painting should be polished to a great degree. Sometimes it may take weeks to finish one. Let's look at some examples of marketing art and how long it took for them to do it. The first thing is key art. Key art is a high resolution images used for promoting the game by giving the audience a clear first impression of the product. This kind of marketing art can take up to 10 to 14 days to work on. Box art. Box art is the illustration that represents the game that can be found on the box cover of the physical product. It's very much like the cover of a book. So, other than being descriptive, it should also be appealing. This kind of marketing art can take up to 5 days to finish. 5 working days to be exact. Murals. Murals are massive, high resolution pieces of art that can be applied directly on a wall, ceiling, or other surfaces. The architectural elements of the given space are harmoniously incorporated into the work. Splash screen or online content. Splash screens and online marketing assets need to communicate as much as possible about the product in a single image at the same time as capturing the audience imagination and making them want to be part of that world. Merchandise design. Sometimes concept artists are asked to translate the original design into a toy format. This means the design might need to be simplified, and you also must define the materials used to create that as a toy, and maybe also how the construction works that allows some movement if that is required. Here are some concepts that we did for this class's demo. The cybernetic woman poster. The top leftmost concept is our earliest exploration of the cybernetic character. Our initial brief was to make it strong and masculine before we decided to pivot to a more feminine character. This was done by using the photo patching approach, which means assembling different parts of multiple photos to make something totally new. There is a character pose concept as well. That was used as a preparation for our photo shoot of the model. The brief was to come up with different poses for a cybernetic woman who is tinkering with her stomach. After we've done the photo shoot, we also did a composition sketch to find that graphical look for our final poster. This concept provides ideas of how the neon light behind the character can be presented. I was mainly thinking about the shape and how it relates to the focal point, the face. Does it help the viewer look at the focal point or not? Then there is the neon light concept itself. I try to come up with neon symbols that has some meaning of reincarnation. And that's it for the intro to concept art. I hope this session has given you a quick look at the world of concept art. What concept art actually is, how to make a good design, what types of concept art there are, and how it lives in the production pipeline. If you wish to learn more in depth on concept art in your own spare time, you can have a look at these links here. These are actually pretty good. Thanks everyone, and have a good day.